The phone call came at 3 in the morning. David Matthews sat up in his empty bed, the blue glow of his smartphone cutting through the darkness of his Denver apartment. The name on the screen made his heart skip. Lila. He hadn't heard from her in 6 months, not since that whirlwind week in Bangkok that had felt like stepping into another man's life entirely. His thumb hovered over the answer button, memories flooding back of jasmine-scented nights and promises whispered in broken English. When he finally swiped to accept the call, her voice came through tears and desperation. "David, I need to tell you something. I'm pregnant, and the baby is yours." The words hit him like a physical blow. 53 years old, recently widowed after 30 years of marriage to Sarah, and now this. His hands trembled as he gripped the phone tighter. The silence stretched between them across continents, filled with the weight of everything this meant. His carefully rebuilt life, his late wife's memory, his grown children who were still processing their mother's death, everything suddenly felt fragile, hanging by threads he couldn't see. Before we continue with David's story, if you're finding this tale compelling, please hit that subscribe button. Stories like these, real, raw, and sometimes shocking, are what we share here, and your support helps us bring more truth to light. David Matthews had never imagined his life would take such a turn. Born and raised in Colorado, he'd built what most would call the American dream. A successful career in telecommunications, a beautiful wife who'd stood by him through every challenge, 2 children who'd grown into remarkable adults. Sarah's battle with cancer had lasted 3 brutal years, and when she finally lost that fight, David felt like half of his soul had been ripped away. The house they'd shared for 25 years became a mausoleum of memories, her coffee cup still in the kitchen sink, her books dog-eared and waiting on the nightstand, her perfume lingering in the closets like a ghost refusing to leave. His children, Mark and Jennifer, had been worried about him. The man who'd once been the life of every barbecue, who'd coached Little League and taught them to drive stick shift in empty parking lots, had become a shadow of himself. He'd go days without speaking to another human being, surviving on takeout and old movies, wearing the same clothes until his daughter would show up unannounced to force him into the shower and into clean shirts. It was Mark who'd suggested the trip, not as therapy, but as an awakening. "Dad, you need to remember who you are outside of being her husband," he'd said, the words cutting deeper than any scalpel. "She wouldn't want you to disappear like this." The business trip to Thailand had been perfectly timed. His company needed someone to oversee a new telecommunications contract in Bangkok, and David volunteered before anyone else could raise their hand. It felt like running away, and maybe it was, but sometimes running towards something unknown is the only way to stop running from what you've lost. Bangkok hit him like a fever dream. The heat, the chaos, the colors so vivid they hurt his eyes after months of seeing the world in shades of gray. Everything smelled of spices and exhaust and life moving at a pace that demanded you either keep up or get swept away. He'd been in Bangkok for 3 days, conducting meetings during the scorching afternoons and returning to his hotel room to stare at CNN and room service menus when he met her. Lila worked at the high-end restaurant where his business partners had taken him for dinner, not as a server but as something more sophisticated. A hostess who spoke 4 languages and seemed to glide between tables like she owned the place. She was 28, though she looked younger, with the kind of beauty that seemed effortless until you realized how much careful attention went into every detail. Her English was accented but precise, and when she smiled at him during introductions, David felt something stir in his chest that he thought had died with Sarah. That first conversation lasted 47 minutes. He knew because he kept checking his watch, amazed that he was actually talking to someone who wasn't asking about quarterly reports or offering condolences he no longer wanted to hear. Lila asked about Colorado, about snow. She'd never seen snow, she said, touching his arm with fingers that felt like electricity. She told him about growing up in rural Thailand, about working her way to Bangkok through jobs that demanded she be smarter than everyone assumed she was. There was something in her eyes, a hunger that reminded him of his younger self, back when everything felt possible and the world seemed designed for his success. When she asked if he'd like to see the real Bangkok, not the sanitized version his business partners had shown him, David surprised himself by saying yes. That night, she led him through markets that stayed open until dawn, where vendors sold everything from silk scarves to live scorpions, where the air was thick with grease and incense and the laughter of people who understood something about joy that David had forgotten. They ate from street carts, Lila laughing at his attempts to handle chopsticks, teaching him Thai phrases that probably meant something different than what she told him they meant. When she kissed him outside a temple where monks had been chanting since before the sunset, David felt like he was cheating on a ghost, and for the first time in 2 years, he didn't care. Lila moved through David's week in Bangkok like a whirlwind, transforming what should have been another business trip into something that felt like stolen time. She knew the city in ways that amazed him, which taxi drivers wouldn't cheat foreigners, which restaurants served food that wouldn't send him to the hotel doctor, which temples offered the kind of peace that doesn't come from guidebooks. More than that, she seemed to know him in ways that startled him awake at night. She'd watch him during dinner and ask why he looked sad when he thought no one was paying attention. She'd take his hand when they walked through crowded streets, not possessively, but like an anchor keeping him tethered to something real. The physical connection between them was immediate and overwhelming. David hadn't touched another woman since Sarah's diagnosis, hadn't even considered the possibility. His body felt foreign to him, like he was borrowing someone else's skin, someone younger and more reckless. Lila's apartment was a studio on the 11th floor of a building with no elevator, filled with textbooks in multiple languages and photographs of family members whose names she whispered to him like secrets. She was working toward a business degree, she told him, saving money for classes by working at the restaurant and teaching English to children on weekends. Her dreams were precise and ambitious. She wanted to start an import business, bringing Thai crafts to international markets, building something that would let her take care of her parents who still lived in the village where she'd been born. But even in those honeyed days, there were moments that felt slightly off-key. Phone calls she'd taken rapid Thai while stepping onto the balcony, conversations that ended abruptly when he entered the room, small things, inconsistencies in stories about her family, expensive jewelry that she claimed was fake, a way of watching him sometimes like she was calculating something he couldn't see. David pushed these observations away, telling himself he was being paranoid, that grief had made him suspicious of good things. When you've lost everything that mattered, it's hard to trust anything that feels like a gift. Their last night together was supposed to be a farewell dinner at the restaurant where they'd met. Instead, Lila took him to her favorite spot, a rooftop bar where Bangkok spread out below them like a circuit board, all lights and movement and electronic music that thrummed in their chests. She drank more than usual that night, switching between English and Thai as she talked about her plans, her family, her fears about the future. At some point, she started crying, though she wouldn't explain why. David held her against his chest, feeling her tears soak through his shirt, wanting to promise her things he had no right to promise, wanting to stay in Bangkok forever or take her home to Colorado or do anything that would keep this feeling alive. When they made love that night, it felt different, more desperate, like she was trying to memorize him through her skin. She whispered things in Thai that he pretended to understand, traced patterns on his chest with her fingertips like she was writing messages only she could read. In the morning, when his alarm went off at 5:30 for his flight back to Denver, she was already awake, sitting by the window and smoking a cigarette he didn't know she'd started. "I wish you didn't have to go," she said without looking at him, and David felt his heart crack in ways it hadn't since Sarah's funeral. The goodbye at the airport was supposed to be final. They both knew it. A beautiful week that would live in memory, untainted by the complications of real life. Lila kissed him like she meant it, pressed a small Buddha pendant into his palm and told him to remember Thailand whenever he needed to feel alive again. David watched her walk away through the terminal, her figure getting smaller until she disappeared into the crowd and felt something settling back into place in his chest. The fantasy was over. Real life was waiting in Denver with his empty house and his worried children and his job that would require him to pretend this week had never happened. Returning to Denver felt like stepping back into black and white after a week of Technicolor. His house looked smaller somehow, filled with Sarah's things and the careful quiet of a man living alone. Mark and Jennifer noticed the change in him immediately. There was color in his face again, a lightness in his step that had been missing since their mother's death. They didn't ask questions, but David could see them exchanging looks, worried that any probing might send him back into the darkness he'd been carrying. His work colleagues made jokes about Thai massages and exotic adventures, but David deflected with the skill of a man who'd learned to guard his privacy in a world that felt invasive. For 3 months, Lila existed in his memory like a beautiful secret. He didn't try to contact her, and she didn't reach out to him. This felt right, clean, honest, preserving something perfect by leaving it untouched. But late at night, when the house felt too quiet and Sarah's absence pressed against him like a physical weight, David would hold the Buddha pendant Lila had given him and remember what it felt like to want something again, to feel desired by someone who didn't know him as half of a couple or as a man defined by loss. Then the messages started, first a simple, "Hello, how are you?" through Facebook Messenger. Then photos, Lila at work, Lila visiting temples, Lila with friends whose faces he didn't recognize. Nothing demanding, nothing that crossed lines, just gentle reminders that she was still there, still thinking about him. David found himself looking forward to these glimpses into her world, responding with careful messages about Colorado weather and work projects, maintaining the fiction that they were just friends who'd shared a pleasant week in Bangkok. The escalation was gradual enough that David didn't notice it happening. Lila's messages became more frequent, more personal. She started calling him late at night, Thailand time, which meant early evening in Denver. She'd tell him about problems at work, about family issues that required money she didn't have, about dreams that felt increasingly out of reach. David found himself offering advice, then emotional support, then small amounts of money transferred through Western Union for emergencies that always seemed urgent and legitimate. Her father needed medicine, her motorbike had been stolen, her landlord was threatening eviction. Each request came with apologies, with promises to pay him back, with explanations that made perfect sense in the moment. David told himself he was helping a friend, that the amounts were small enough not to matter, that he could afford to be generous with someone who'd given him back pieces of himself he'd thought were lost forever. What he didn't admit, even to himself, was how good it felt to be needed again, to be someone's hero instead of someone's burden. The pregnancy call changed everything. Sitting in his dark bedroom at 3 a.m, listening to Lila's tears through international static, David felt the careful walls he'd built around his new life crumbling in real time. She was 8 weeks along, she said, and she was scared. Her family would disown her for having a child outside marriage, especially with a foreign man. She couldn't afford to raise a baby alone in Bangkok, couldn't continue working through the pregnancy, couldn't face the shame of returning to her village. The math was simple and devastating. Their last night together, her tears that he'd attributed to sadness about his departure, the desperation in her touch that had felt like passion but might have been something else entirely. "I didn't want to tell you," Lila sobbed through the phone. "I tried to handle it myself, but I can't. I need help, David. I need you." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with implications that made David's hands shake. He was 53 years old, his children were adults with lives of their own, his wife was dead, and now this woman on the other side of the world was carrying what might be his child. The responsible thing would be to demand a paternity test, to ask questions, to protect himself legally and financially. Instead, he heard himself asking what she needed, how he could help, what they were going to do. I want to pause here for a moment. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever found yourself in a situation where emotions overrode logic, please hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments. Have you or someone you know ever faced unexpected news that changed everything? Your stories help others feel less alone in their struggles. The transformation in their relationship was immediate and overwhelming. Suddenly, David wasn't just Lila's friend or former lover. He was her lifeline, her only hope, the father of her unborn child who lived thousands of miles away and had responsibilities she couldn't fully understand. Their daily conversations became planning sessions punctuated by tears and desperate declarations of love that felt both genuine and performative. Lila painted pictures of their future that were beautiful and impossible, David moving to Thailand or bringing her to America, or finding some way to bridge the vast distances between their worlds. The money requests escalated with her supposed pregnancy symptoms, doctor visits, prenatal vitamins, special foods that would keep the baby healthy, time off work that meant lost income. David found himself transferring larger and larger amounts, watching his savings account shrink as Lila's needs grew. $500 for medical bills, $1,000 for rent when morning sickness made it impossible for her to work full shifts, $1,500 for a security deposit on a better apartment where she could raise their child safely. Each request came with ultrasound photos that looked legitimate to David's untrained eye, with medical documents written in Thai that he couldn't read but assumed were authentic. His children noticed the changes in him before he realized they were happening. Mark cornered him after a family dinner where David had been distracted, checking his phone constantly for messages from Bangkok. "Dad, what's going on? You seem stressed about something." David deflected, claimed work was demanding, changed the subject to safe topics like sports and weather. But Jennifer was more direct, showing up at his house unannounced and finding Western Union receipts scattered across his kitchen table like evidence of crimes he couldn't name. "Dad, are you being scammed?" Jennifer's voice was gentle but firm, the tone she'd learned from her mother when difficult conversations couldn't be avoided any longer. David's first instinct was anger. How dare his daughter suggest he was naive enough to be taken advantage of by someone he cared about? But as he tried to explain about Lila, about their connection, about the baby they were having together, the words sounded strange in his own mouth. Jennifer listened without judgment, asking questions that David couldn't answer satisfactorily. How well did he really know this woman? Had he met her family, her friends, anyone who could verify her stories? Had he considered that someone might target recently widowed men who traveled alone to foreign countries? The seed of doubt, once planted, grew with vicious efficiency. David started paying attention to details he'd ignored before. Lila's ultrasound photos, when he looked at them closely, had dates that didn't quite align with the timeline she'd given him. Her medical documents were always photographed, never scanned, making it impossible to verify their authenticity. Her stories about morning sickness and doctor visits changed slightly each time she told them, small inconsistencies that might have been translation errors or memory lapses, but might have been something else entirely. The breaking point came 4 months after the pregnancy call. David had sent nearly $20,000 to Thailand, depleting the savings account he'd built with Sarah over decades of careful planning. He was starting to borrow against his retirement funds, telling himself it was temporary, that he'd figure out the financial details once the baby was born and he could make permanent plans. That's when Lila called with the most devastating news yet. She'd been in an accident, hit by a motorbike while walking to the doctor. She was in the hospital, the baby was in danger, she needed immediate surgery that wasn't covered by Thailand's medical system. The cost was enormous, $50,000 that would save both her life and their child's life, money that David didn't have but somehow needed to find. The desperation in her voice was so convincing that David almost didn't notice the detail that changed everything. In the background of their call, he could hear music, not the sterile quiet of a hospital room, but the bass-heavy pop music that had played in Bangkok's clubs and restaurants. When he asked about it, Lila's explanation was rushed and contradictory. She was calling from a friend's phone, she said, because her phone had been broken in the accident. But the friend was visiting her in the hospital, playing music to keep her spirits up. The story made sense on the surface, but something about it felt rehearsed, like dialogue from a play he'd stumbled into without knowing he was performing. That night, David did something he should have done months earlier. He hired a private investigator who specialized in international fraud, a woman named Patricia Chen who spoke fluent Thai and had contacts throughout Southeast Asia. "Mr. Matthews," Patricia told him during their first phone call, I hate to tell you this, but what you're describing is one of the most common scams targeting Western men. The pregnancy angle, the medical emergencies, the gradual escalation of financial demands, it's all textbook. Give me 72 hours and a small retainer, and I'll give you the truth you need to hear. The truth was worse than David had prepared himself for. Lila wasn't pregnant, had never been pregnant, and probably couldn't get pregnant due to a hysterectomy she'd had 3 years earlier after complications from a previous abortion. The medical documents were forgeries, available for purchase in Bangkok's markets for less than $50 each. The ultrasound photos had been downloaded from medical websites and doctored with fake dates and information. More devastating still, David wasn't Lila's only victim. Patricia's investigation uncovered at least 6 other Western men who'd received similar calls, similar sob stories, similar requests for money to save fictitious pregnancies. The amounts varied based on what each man could afford. David's contributions were actually on the higher end, suggesting that Lila had researched his financial situation more thoroughly than he'd realized. But the detail that hurt most was this. Lila's real name was Siraporn Thanakit, and she wasn't struggling to make ends meet in Bangkok. She owned a successful business importing electronics from China, lived in a luxury condominium in one of Bangkok's most expensive districts, and drove a car that cost more than David's annual salary. The sad story about growing up in rural poverty, about working multiple jobs to pay for business school, about supporting elderly parents, all of it was fiction, crafted specifically to appeal to men like David who'd built their identities around being providers and protectors. The confrontation when it came was surreal in its banality. David called Lila Siraporn, with Patricia's report in front of him, his hands shaking with anger and heartbreak and something that felt like relief. When she answered the phone with her usual breathless, "Hello, darling," David felt like he was talking to a stranger wearing the voice of someone he'd loved. He read her the facts Patricia had uncovered, waiting for denials or explanations or some desperate attempt to maintain the fiction they'd built together. Instead, there was silence. Long, heavy silence punctuated by what sounded like traffic in the background. When Siraporn finally spoke, her voice was different, colder, more calculating, empty of the warmth and vulnerability that had made David feel necessary and wanted. "So now you know," she said simply. "What are you going to do about it?" The question hung between them like a challenge. David had expected tears, apologies, some acknowledgement of the pain she'd caused. Instead, she sounded almost bored, like this conversation was an inconvenience in her day rather than the destruction of everything he'd believed about their relationship. The next 20 minutes were the most brutal of David's life since sitting in oncology waiting rooms during Sarah's treatment. Siraporn laid out the situation with businesslike efficiency. She had recordings of their phone conversations, copies of their text messages, photographs from their week together in Bangkok. If David caused problems for her, if he went to authorities, if he tried to warn other potential victims, if he made any attempt to recover the money he'd sent, she would make their relationship public. She would send evidence of their affair to his children, to his former colleagues, to anyone whose opinion mattered to him. She would claim he'd promised to marry her, that he'd abandoned her when she needed him most, that he was the kind of man who took advantage of young women in foreign countries. "You Americans are all the same," Siraporn said, her English suddenly precise and unaccented. "You think you can buy love with your money and your passports. You think women like me should be grateful for whatever attention you give us. The truth is, David, you got exactly what you paid for. You wanted to feel young again, wanted to feel desired, wanted to believe you were rescuing someone who needed you. I gave you all of that. The fact that it wasn't real doesn't mean it wasn't worth the price." The blackmail was subtle but clear. David could pursue justice, could try to expose Siraporn's operation, could attempt to warn other men about her methods. But the cost would be his reputation, his relationships with his children, his carefully maintained privacy about the grief and loneliness that had driven him into her arms. She knew with devastating accuracy that men like David would rather lose money than lose face, would rather be quietly victimized than publicly humiliated. For 3 weeks after that final phone call, David barely left his house. He told his children he had the flu, told his work he was taking personal time, told himself he was processing what had happened and deciding how to move forward. In reality, he was paralyzed by shame and anger and a grief that felt different from losing Sarah, but somehow just as profound. He'd been mourning the death of love, now he was mourning the death of trust, the realization that his judgment had been compromised by loneliness and hope in ways that might have permanent consequences. The money was gone. Patricia had confirmed that recovering funds sent voluntarily through international transfers was virtually impossible, even with evidence of fraud. David's savings were depleted, his retirement plans were disrupted, and his children were asking increasingly pointed questions about his financial situation and mental state. Worse than the financial damage was the psychological impact. Every emotion he'd felt during his time with Siraporn now felt suspect, tainted by the knowledge that it had been manufactured and manipulated. Had any of it been real? Had she felt anything genuine for him, even briefly, or had he been nothing more than a walking ATM from the moment they'd met? The turning point came when David found himself researching flights to Bangkok, planning a confrontation that he knew would be pointless and potentially dangerous. That's when he realized how completely Siraporn had gotten into his head, how she'd made him feel responsible for her well-being even after he knew she was victimizing him. The urge to save her, to believe there was some explanation that would make everything make sense, was still there despite all evidence to the contrary. It was Jennifer who snapped him out of this spiral, arriving at his house unannounced and finding him surrounded by printouts of flight schedules and hotel reservations. "Dad, you're scaring me," Jennifer said, sitting down beside him on the couch where he'd been sleeping for days, unable to face the bedroom he'd shared with Sarah. "Whatever happened in Thailand, whatever this woman did to you, going back there isn't going to fix it. It's going to make everything worse." Her voice was gentle but firm, carrying the authority of someone who'd inherited her mother's ability to cut through confusion and focus on truth. "You need help, Dad, professional help. And you need to tell us what's really going on." The confession, when it came, felt like surgery without anesthesia. David told his children everything about the loneliness that had driven him to Thailand, about meeting Siraporn, about the fake pregnancy and the money and the months of believing he was going to be a father again. Mark and Jennifer listened without judgment, asking practical questions about finances and legal options, but David could see the pain in their eyes. Not just disappointment in his choices, but genuine anguish at seeing their father so completely taken advantage of during his most vulnerable period. "The money doesn't matter," Mark said finally, after David had finished explaining the full scope of his losses. "Money can be replaced. What matters is that you're okay, that you're safe, that you don't let this destroy what Mom spent 30 years helping you build." The reference to Sarah was deliberate and devastating. David realized that his children weren't just worried about the scam. They were worried that his grief had made him into someone their mother wouldn't recognize, someone who made decisions based on desperation rather than wisdom. Recovery began with small, practical steps. David worked with a financial advisor to restructure his retirement plans, accepting that he'd need to work longer than anticipated, but acknowledging that the damage wasn't irreversible. He started seeing a therapist who specialized in grief counseling, someone who helped him understand that his vulnerability to Siraporn's manipulation wasn't a character flaw but a natural consequence of loss and isolation. Most importantly, he stopped trying to make sense of Siraporn's motivations or preserve any romantic illusions about their relationship. The legal options were limited but not non-existent. Patricia Chen connected David with international law enforcement agencies that tracked romance scams, and his case became part of a larger investigation into Siraporn's operation. David learned that he was one of dozens of victims, men from America, Australia, and Europe who'd all received variations of the same script, the same fake medical emergencies, the same manipulative blend of desperation and desire. The scope of Siraporn's business was staggering. She'd stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars over several years, using the money to fund a lifestyle that would have been impossible through legitimate means. But perhaps more important than any legal resolution was David's gradual understanding of why he'd been so vulnerable to Siraporn's approach. The therapist helped him see that his grief for Sarah had created a perfect storm of loneliness, guilt about moving forward, and desperate hunger for connection. Sarah porn hadn't just targeted his wallet, she'd targeted his fundamental human need to feel necessary, desired, and capable of protecting someone he loved. The fake pregnancy wasn't just about money, it was about giving David a purpose that felt bigger than his own healing. 6 months after learning the truth about Sarah porn, David was finally able to talk about the experience without feeling like he was confessing to crimes. He joined a support group for scam victims, discovering that his story wasn't unique and his shame wasn't necessary. Men and women of all ages from all backgrounds had fallen for similar schemes. The common thread wasn't stupidity or desperation, it was basic human decency, the belief that love and need were real until proven otherwise. The support group was where David met Eleanor, a retired teacher who'd lost her husband 2 years earlier and had been targeted by a different kind of scam, fake military officers deployed overseas who needed money for emergency leave to visit her. Eleanor's losses had been smaller than David's, but her emotional journey was remarkably similar. They bonded over their shared experience of feeling foolish, then angry, then gradually accepting that being victimized didn't make them stupid. It made them human. Their relationship developed slowly, built on honesty about their respective vulnerabilities and mistakes. Eleanor had also struggled with guilt about moving forward after her husband's death, had also found herself hungry for connection with someone who hadn't known her as half of a couple. But their approach to each other was careful, grounded in reality rather than fantasy, based on shared interests and values rather than rescue fantasies or manufactured emergencies. A year after the Sarah porn debacle, David was in a completely different place psychologically and financially. His retirement plans were back on track, his relationship with his children had deepened through the crisis, and his understanding of himself had evolved in ways that felt permanent and positive. He still thought about Bangkok sometimes, but not with the romantic longing that had made him vulnerable to manipulation. Instead, he remembered it as a lesson in the difference between authentic connection and skilled performance. The final piece of closure came unexpectedly. Patricia Chen called David 18 months after their first conversation with news that Sarah porn had been arrested in Bangkok as part of an international investigation into romance fraud. She was facing charges that could result in significant prison time, and investigators had recovered evidence of her operations that spanned multiple countries and hundreds of victims. David felt no satisfaction in her arrest. By then, his anger had been replaced by something closer to pity for someone who'd built an entire life around exploiting other people's loneliness. The thing about people like her, Patricia explained during their final conversation, is that they're usually running from something too. The money, the lifestyle, the power over other people. It's all a way of avoiding their own problems. She victimized you, but in a weird way, she was also victimizing herself. That doesn't excuse what she did, but it might help you understand that this was never really about you personally. Today, David understands that his experience with Sarah porn was both unique and universal. Unique in its specific details, the fake pregnancy, the cultural differences, the sophisticated manipulation techniques. Universal in its basic elements, a lonely person seeking connection, a skilled predator exploiting that loneliness, and the gradual realization that love and trust require verification as well as faith. He's learned to distinguish between being open to love and being desperate for it, between helping someone in need and being manipulated by someone who's made need into a weapon. His relationship with Eleanor is built on transparency rather than mystery, on shared activities rather than dramatic crises, on mutual respect rather than rescue fantasies. They both understand that real love doesn't require emergency financial transfers or international travel to prove its authenticity. The money he lost to Sarah porn has become, in David's mind, tuition for an education he never wanted but desperately needed. He learned that grief can make anyone vulnerable to exploitation, that loneliness can cloud judgment in ways that feel impossible until they happen to you, and that recovery from emotional fraud requires the same patience and self-compassion as recovery from any other trauma. Most importantly, David learned that his children had been right from the beginning. Sarah wouldn't want him to disappear into darkness. But she also wouldn't want him to compromise his values or safety in his search for light. The love he'd shared with his wife for 30 years had taught him what authentic connection felt like. His vulnerability to Siriporn's manipulation hadn't erased that knowledge. It had just temporarily clouded his ability to access it. The story David tells now in support groups and to friends who worry about online dating and international travel isn't one of victimhood or shame. It's a story about resilience, about the human capacity to recover from betrayal and learn to trust again, more wisely but no less fully. He doesn't regret the week he spent with Siriporn in Bangkok. It was beautiful, and it served its purpose of reminding him that he was still capable of feeling alive. What he regrets is allowing that week to become something it was never meant to be, letting fantasy overtake reality until the cost became unbearable. If you're watching this and you've experienced something similar, whether it's romance fraud, investment scams, or any other situation where someone exploited your trust and goodwill, know that you're not alone and you're not stupid. Predators are skilled at what they do precisely because they target our best impulses rather than our worst ones. They exploit our capacity for love, generosity, and hope because those are strengths, not weaknesses. Recovery is possible. Trust can be rebuilt. Love can be found again, more safely and more authentically than before. The key is learning to verify without becoming cynical, to remain open without becoming naive, to understand that protecting yourself doesn't mean closing yourself off from genuine connection. David's story continues, but it's no longer defined by what Siriporn took from him. It's defined by what he's built since then: stronger relationships with his children, a healthier understanding of grief and healing, a partnership with Eleanor that's grounded in reality rather than fantasy, and a sense of purpose that comes from helping other people avoid the traps he fell into. The Buddha pendant Siriporn gave him still sits in his desk drawer, not as a reminder of their relationship, but as a symbol of the difference between authentic spirituality and manufactured meaning. Real peace, real love, real connection can't be purchased or performed. They have to be cultivated through honesty, patience, and the courage to remain vulnerable despite the risks that vulnerability entails. If this story has resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel and share your own experiences in the comments below. Stories like David's remind us that healing is possible, that wisdom can emerge from pain, and that our worst experiences can become the foundation for our strongest growth. Keep watching for more real stories about resilience, recovery, and the endless human capacity for renewal.